The barn smelled of wet earth and iron and the particular terror of a living thing in crisis. Rain drove sideways through the gaps in the weathered siding, and the wind had teeth that night, the kind that found every seam in a man's coat and reminded him that the panhandle did not care whether he lived or died out here. Caleb Rourke had been crouched in the far stall for the better part of an hour, his forearms resting on his knees, watching the mare with the quiet attention of a man who had learned that patience was the only language animals trusted. Her name was Calla, and she was 3 years old and first time laboring, and she was in trouble. He knew it the way he knew weather, not from any single sign, but from the accumulation of small wrongnesses, the angle of her breathing, the way her hindquarters kept shifting, the absence of progress where there should have been some by now. He had sent the ranch hand, a boy named Thomas, into town for the veterinarian 40 minutes ago, and he did not believe Thomas would be back in time. The road into Dusty Creek ran low through a dry creek bed that was not dry tonight, and the storm had turned that 30-minute ride into something considerably longer. Caleb was calculating odds, the kind you calculated when you had no good options, only less bad ones, when the barn door tore open and the wind came in, and with the wind came May Calloway. She stood in the doorway for half a second, rain-soaked and breathing hard, her dark hair plastered flat against her neck, and she took in the scene with eyes that moved quick and registered everything. She was not supposed to be here. She had been at the bunkhouse kitchen, as she was most Friday evenings, cooking for the hands. He had noticed her arrival 3 weeks ago, the way a man notices a change in the weather, not with particular interest, but with the automatic note-taking of someone who needs to track what is happening around him. Widow woman, husband's debts, Hattie Greer's boarding house. Plain was the general consensus in town, quiet, competent with a needle, and unremarkable in every other way. Caleb had not formed an opinion because he had not had cause to. She stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her against the wind. "I saw the light," she said. Her voice was steady, not apologetic. "What do we need?" It was not a question. He looked at her for one measured moment. "Foal's caught," he said. "Position's wrong. I need another pair of hands." She was already moving. She set her lantern on the stall rail, shrugged off her outer coat, and rolled both sleeves past the elbow with the brisk efficiency of someone who had made peace with the fact that the work was going to be unpleasant before the work had even started. She knelt beside him in the hay and looked at the mare with that same quick registering gaze. "Tell me what to do," she said. So he told her. He spoke low and without embellishment, the way he talked to men he trusted to actually listen, and she listened the way those men did, without interrupting, without flinching, with her whole attention on what he was saying and not on herself. Calla shifted and made a sound that was mostly exhaustion, and May laid a hand on the mare's flank, not soothing exactly, just present, and said, "Easy. We have you." Caleb did not examine why that landed on him the way it did. He had work to do. The next 40 minutes were the kind that stripped everything non-essential away. There was the heat of the lamp. There was the cold driving through the siding. There was the smell of blood and rain and horse and sweat, and there was the work itself, specific, demanding, unforgiving of distraction. And May met all of it without comment. He spoke instructions once, and she followed them, and when something required adaptation, she adapted without being told. Her hands were small, and she was not a large woman, but she had a steadiness in her that was almost physical, something you could lean against. He found himself, at one point, relying on it. The foal came just past midnight, ungainly and slick and breathing. Yes, and they both sat back in the hay and let the relief move through them in silence. Calla turned and began the business of knowing her foal, and the lamp swung lightly in a draft, and the rain had begun to ease. May had blood on her forearms and her dress and a smear of it along her jaw where she had pushed her hair back with a wet hand, and she was looking at the foal with an expression that was entirely unguarded, entirely without performance. Open was the word, like a door that had been opened from the inside. Caleb looked at her, not the noting the weather kind of looking, the other kind, the kind that arrived without permission and did not leave when you wanted it to. He looked, and something moved in him like the first slow shift of earth before a crack runs through it. Geez, and he did not name it, and he did not speak it, and he looked away before she could catch him at it. But it was done. Whatever it was done. He said, "You did well." She said, without looking at him, "She did the hard part." He almost smiled. He did not let it happen, but it was a closer thing than it had been in a long time. The town of Dusty Creek was not a place that kept its own counsel. This was the nature of small places in the Panhandle. The gossip moved faster than the wind and hit harder, and everyone's hunger and pride and loneliness had been folded down into the daily business of watching what other people did and making meaning of it. May had understood this within her first week. She had arrived in May with a trunk, a debt ledger, and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been grieving in public for longer than grief actually lasted, and she had set about becoming invisible as quickly as she could manage it. Invisibility was a skill she had been refining since childhood. She was not remarkable looking. She knew this, had always known it, had been told it with varying degrees of kindness by the people who were supposed to think otherwise. Her late husband Gerald had said she was handsome enough, and the enough had done its work on her over 5 years of marriage until she had stopped looking in mirrors with any expectation. She was capable, and she was practical, and she made decent money with her needle and her cooking and her willingness to do what needed doing without complaint, and that was sufficient. Sufficient was the word she had built a life inside. She had not expected Dusty Creek to be anything other than a transaction, settle Gerald's outstanding debts to the Harlow brothers, stay long enough to work off the balance through contract cooking at the Rourke Ranch, and then move on to some other town where she could be invisible with less effort. She had not expected Hattie Greer, and who rented her the back room at a fair price and talked without stopping, and looked at May sometimes with an expression that suggested she was seeing something May herself was not aware of showing. She had not expected Dylan Rourke, who was 28 years old and charming in the unthinking way of men who had been told by enough women that they were charming and who had taken to stopping by the bunkhouse kitchen on his way back from wherever Dylan Rourke spent his time, leaning in the doorway and trying to make her laugh. He was not serious, and she did not take him seriously, but he was pleasant, and pleasant was something she had not had much of lately, and she let him talk. She had not expected the elder brother at all. Caleb Rourke did not come to the kitchen. He did not stop in doorways. He passed through the ranch yard in the mornings like a weather system, purposeful, contained, utterly sufficient unto himself, and the hands moved around him the way river water moved around a fixed stone. He spoke in commands that were not cruel, but were not soft either, and the men obeyed him not because they feared him, but because he was almost always right, and being right was a form of authority that held longer than any other kind. May had noticed him in the same automatic way she noticed all the things in her environment that had weight and potential consequence, and she had filed him in the category of things that did not apply to her and returned to her work. The night in the barn had made that categorization difficult to maintain, not because of anything he had said or done, though he had been exactly as spare and exacting as she would have predicted, and he had thanked her in 4 words and meant it, which was more honesty than most people offered. But he had looked at her once in the aftermath, when the foal was breathing and the panic had drained away, and in that look there had been something she did not have a name for. Not desire exactly, or not just a desire, but a quality of attention so thorough it felt like being read. May had spent a great deal of her life being seen without being noticed. This was the opposite. She washed her arms at the pump before walking back to Hattie's in the thinning rain, and she told herself she had imagined it, and she almost believed herself, and then she lay awake for 2 hours in the dark room at Hattie's place and did not believe herself at all. What, in the morning, Hattie set a plate of eggs in front of her and said, without preamble, "I hear you helped Caleb Rourke bring in a foal last night." "Word travels," May said. "This is Dusty Creek," Hattie said, as though that answered everything, which it did. She poured coffee and sat down without being invited, which was her habit, and studied May with the frank assessment she applied to everything. "He's not an easy man," she said. "I'm not looking for an easy man," May said. "I'm not looking for any man." Said Hattie, which was the most skeptical sound May had ever heard a human being produce. May drank her coffee and said nothing else, and Hattie smiled at her plate in a way that May chose not to address. Caleb did not think about her. This was a thing he told himself with some regularity over the following 2 weeks, and it was mostly true in the sense that he did not allow himself to sit with the thought when it arose. which was more often than he was comfortable acknowledging and less often than she probably deserved considering. He was a man who ran a cattle operation in the hardest geography the state offered, who managed 11 men and 2,000 acres and the kind of seasonal violence that came with panhandle weather. And he did not have architecture in his life for what May Calloway had introduced into it. He had removed that architecture years ago after Lena, and he had done a thorough job of it, and he was not in the habit of rebuilding what he had torn down for good reason. The reason had been this. Lena Voss had been the most beautiful woman in Dusty Creek, and she had known it and weaponized it with the clinical efficiency of someone who understood that beauty was currency and intended to spend it well. Caleb had been 28 and not yet fully hardened, and he had believed, for the better part of a year, that what Lena offered him was real. He had been wrong in a way that required the better part of the following 5 years to absorb. He did not speak of it, because speaking of it changed nothing and changed you in the process. He had made certain economies after Lena, emotional ones, none of the kind you made when you had been through a particular kind of winter and could not afford to pretend it had not happened. He had become very good at those economies. What he had not been prepared for was the specific and inconvenient fact of May Calloway's competence. It was not the first time he had encountered a capable woman, and capability alone was not the thing. It was the absence of performance in it. Lena had been capable too, in her way, but everything Lena did was staged, every action calculated for its effect on whoever was watching. May seemed genuinely indifferent to whether anyone was watching. She worked, and the work was good, and she appeared to require no audience for it. There was something in that which undid him in ways he could not have predicted. He had ridden out to the east pasture that first Monday morning after the barn and spent 4 hours on routine fence work that he normally delegated, and he understood, somewhere around the second post, that he was avoiding the ranch yard. He did not dignify this understanding with any extended examination. He went back to the work. He was crouched over a wire splice on Thursday afternoon when his brother appeared on the fence line, riding the easy lope that meant Dylan was in no particular hurry to be anywhere specific, which was most of the time. Dylan was the better-looking Rourke, which was a fact Caleb had never minded, and Dylan had never stopped being pleasantly aware of. He reined in and watched Caleb work with the idle interest he brought to most things. "Heard you had company in the barn during the storm," Dylan said. "Gee, news moves," Caleb said. "May Calloway's got good hands," Dylan said, and there was nothing in his tone that was calculated. Dylan rarely calculated, but the words did something they should not have done in Caleb's chest. "She does," Caleb said. He kept his eyes on the wire. "Good woman," Dylan said. "Been talking to her some. She's funny when she loosens up a little. I don't think she knows she's funny." Caleb put the fence tool down and looked up at his brother in the afternoon light. Dylan was watching the horizon with the easy vacancy of a man who genuinely had no agenda here. He was just talking. He talked the way other men breathed. Caleb looked back at his work. "Don't," he said. Dylan looked at him. "Don't what?" There was a long silence, the kind that happened in open country where there was no ambient noise to fill the space between two people, and every word had to justify its existence. "Don't be careless with her," Caleb said. Dylan was quiet for a moment, then, carefully, "Caleb, she's not—" He stopped. He started again. "She's got enough on her plate without your particular brand of entertainment." Dylan looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was more perceptive than he usually bothered to deploy. "All right," he said mildly, and touched his hat brim and rode on. Caleb watched him go. The wind moved through the grass in a long, slow wave, and somewhere to the west, a cloud was building. And Caleb sat with the weight of what he had just said, or more precisely what he had not said, until the sun moved enough that the temperature dropped and it was time to move on. The Mercantile on a Saturday morning was the social center of Dusty Creek in the way that only a town with limited alternatives could manage. Hobbs, who ran it, kept the place stocked with the staples and the gossip with equal reliability, and the wide porch out front served as an informal forum where most of the town's opinions were formed and distributed. May went on Saturday mornings because it was necessary, and because she had learned that the fastest route through necessary things was to move through them without hesitation. She was pricing bolt fabric when she heard the door and felt the room change the way rooms change when something enters that is used to commanding them. She did not look up. She knew from the particular quality of the silence and then the particular quality of the resumed conversations that this was not a person who was ordinary. She looked up when she heard the voice. Lena Voss had not been in Dusty Creek in 3 years, and Dusty Creek had not entirely recovered from the first time. She was the kind of beautiful that felt deliberate, as though beauty were something she administered daily and maintained through sheer intentional force. She was wearing traveling clothes that had no business being that well fitted in this dust, and she moved through Hobbs's Mercantile with the specific confidence of a woman who understood that spaces arranged themselves around her. She had 3 women with her, and she was speaking to them in the half-voiced, laughing tone of someone who was aware of being overheard and intended it. May had set eyes on Lena Voss exactly once before, briefly, from a distance, and had noted her with the same automatic logging she applied to all things. She had not understood at that point that Lena had history here. She understood it now from the way the room behaved. She returned to the bolt fabric. She was trying to determine whether she had enough for the altar cloth commission when Lena's voice arrived at full volume and close range. Is that the help?" The words were addressed to the woman beside her, but calibrated for the room. May looked up. Lena was looking at her with an expression of polished, pleasant dismissal, the kind that did not need to raise its voice because it had never learned to doubt its own authority. "I believe she's the new seamstress," someone offered helpfully from behind the pickle barrel. Lena said, looking May up and down with the thoroughness of an appraisal. "I suppose she has that look." She moved on toward the counter in a drift of scent that cost more than May made in a week. The room breathed again. May stood with the bolt fabric in her hands and felt the thing she always felt in these moments: the slow, practiced subsidence, the armoring down, the careful folding of the humiliation into a shape that fit somewhere it wouldn't cause damage. She had done this since she was 11 years old. She was good at it. She set the fabric down. She took her coin purse from her pocket and counted out what she owed, and set the coins in a precise stack on the counter, and said to Hobbs, who could not quite meet her eyes, "Put the rest on the account." She took her parcel, and she walked out. The sun was direct and mean outside, and she stood on the porch for one moment, not visibly composing herself because she did not need to. She was already composed, but simply standing, as a horse stands after a hard pull, not resting so much as recalibrating. She heard the step beside her before she was aware of him being there. She turned. Caleb Rourke was crossing the street from the far side, moving at a pace that was not hurried but was not casual either, and he fell into step beside her, heading away from the Mercantile without breaking stride, as though they had arranged this, as though this was simply where he had been going all along. He did not look at her. He looked ahead, into the street, with the flat, long focus he applied to horizons and moving cattle and fence lines. They walked half a block in silence. Then, without turning, "Don't let her shrink you." His voice was quiet. Nothing in it performed. It was the voice of a man saying the thing he was going to say because it was true and because she needed to hear it, and those were the only reasons he had ever needed. May walked. She kept walking. She did not respond because there was no response that would not have been smaller than what he had just given her. But her hand swung out at her side and came close to his hand, and his hand did not move away, and for a length of 6 or 7 paces their knuckles brushed, and neither of them acknowledged it, and neither of them moved away. And that was the whole of it, and it was the most she had felt in years. She told Hattie none of it. This was partly because Hattie already knew, somehow, by the alchemy of small towns and sharp instincts. Hattie had assembled the approximate facts by Sunday morning and was communicating her knowledge through the elevated warmth of her regard for May and the particular way she refilled her coffee without being asked. May accepted the coffee and the warmth and deflected the more direct inquiries with the focused vagueness she had developed for the purpose. "He walked with you," Hattie said, she with the satisfaction of a woman confirming a theorem. "He was going the same direction," May said. "He was on the other side of the street when Lena came out of Hobbs's place." "He may have been heading somewhere in that general direction," May said. Hattie looked at her for a long, affectionate moment. "May," she said, "that man has not voluntarily positioned himself next to a woman in this town in 5 years. He has crossed to the other side of streets to avoid it. The idea that he happened to be going in your direction. I am not a woman he is interested in, May said. It came out with more force than she intended, and Hattie fell briefly quiet, in the way of someone who recognizes that the person across from them has hit a nerve they did not know was exposed. May set her coffee down. She looked at her hands on the table, the roughened knuckles, the calluses at the base of each finger, the ink stain she had not entirely got out from the ledger work last week. He's being decent, she said more quietly. The way decent men are decent. It doesn't mean anything beyond itself. And you've decided that, Hattie said, because... May did not answer. She picked up her coffee and looked out the window at the street, which was quiet in the early morning and full of long shadows and the smell of cooling dust from overnight. She was aware, as she often was in these moments, of the specific geometry of her own smallness, the way she sat in borrowed rooms in other people's towns and counted out other people's money and made herself useful to offset the fact of her presence. Gerald had done that to her, in increments, the way water does things to stone, not all at once and never with obvious cruelty. It just the steady, patient pressure of his indifference wearing her down to a shape he was more comfortable with. She had not understood it was happening until he was gone, and by then she had already become the woman who believed it, ordinary, sufficient, easy to overlook. I just think, Hattie said finally softly, that the mirror you've been using is broken, and someone who sees you clearly might be worth not running from. May said nothing, but she did not argue, which was new, and Hattie, who was wise enough to know when a point had landed, let the silence stand and went to refill the coffee pot, and the morning light came through the window at a low angle and caught the dust in the air and made it briefly beautiful. The thing about Caleb Rourke was that he was constitutionally incapable of doing things by halves. This was both his greatest utility as a foreman and the thing that had made Lena's betrayal so thorough. When he gave himself to something, he gave the whole of it, and the whole of Caleb Rourke was a considerable thing to put down. He had learned, after Lena, to not give himself to things that could be taken. He gave himself to land, to livestock, to the seasonal necessities of a cattle operation, to the welfare of the men under his charge. These were things that could not lie to him. They were exactly what they appeared to be. You read them correctly or you didn't, and if you didn't, there were consequences. But the land was not malicious, and the cattle were not pretending. What he had not accounted for was May. May Calloway, who also could not lie with any success, which he had determined within the first hour of knowing her, not because she had told him anything, but because she had not performed anything, and the absence of performance in a person was the closest thing to honesty he knew how to recognize. He had begun, since the barn, to notice her in ways that were not voluntary. The way she carried things, evenly, without the small stagecraft of someone who wants credit for their own effort. The way she spoke to the ranch hands, direct, without the nervous deference of someone performing helplessness, and without the performed competence of someone who needs you to know how capable they are. She was simply capable, and simply direct, and she did not seem to need him to observe it. It was the not needing that destroyed him, and he had spent 5 years in the company of women who needed him to observe them, and he had learned to be exhausted by the maintenance of that observation, and he had eventually solved the problem by withdrawing from the observation entirely. May's particular indifference to his regard was the thing that made his regard impossible to withdraw. He was thinking about this in a way he would not have named as thinking about it, riding the south fence line on a Tuesday, with half his mind on a section of wire that had been giving trouble, when he came around a stand of scrub cedar and found her there. She was walking, which was not remarkable. It was a public road, but she was walking with the brisk economy of someone who had somewhere to be and no horse to get her there faster. And she had a basket over one arm and a length of blue cloth tucked under the other, and she did not startle when he appeared, which told him she had heard him coming. She looked up. He reined in. They regarded each other across 10 feet of hard-packed dirt in the flat afternoon light. "Afternoon," she said. "You walking to the Harlow place?" The Harlow place was 2 miles. "Their daughter's got a dress commission," she said. "Road's clear enough." He looked at the road. He looked at the sky. He looked at the basket she was carrying and the cloth and the 2 miles of road. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Get up." She looked at him. He did not clarify. After a moment, she passed the basket up to him, and he held it while she put her foot in the stirrup and came up behind him, settling with the practical ease of someone who had ridden before, not close but not awkward, her hands resting neutral at her sides. He handed the basket back, and they rode. The silence between them on horseback was a different quality than the silence on foot, closer, warmer, carried on the same movement. The horse's gait was slow and even. The afternoon was going gold along the edges. He could smell her hair, something plain and clean, soap and something else under it, something warm. He focused on the road. "You didn't have to," she started. "I know," he said. She stopped. They rode another quarter-mile without speaking. Then she said, "The mare's doing well. The foal." "He is," Caleb said. "Strong legs. Named him after you." She went quiet behind him. He felt the small shift of her weight. "After me," she said carefully. "Figured he earned it," Caleb said, "being born in difficulty and coming out steady anyway." He did not look back. He did not need to. He felt what moved through her in the slight change of the air between them, the way the warmth of it increased, and he looked at the road and let the horse walk and did not take it back. Lena came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning, and she came the way she always came, announced by no one, as if propriety were a rule that applied to everyone but her. Caleb was working at the corral gate when he heard her horse, and he knew the sound of that particular gate before he looked up because he had once known everything about her, and the knowing had not all washed out. She looked exactly as she always had, which was to say extraordinary and untrustworthy, and she dismounted with the fluid grace of a woman who knew she was being watched and approved of it. She had been in Denver, reportedly, or Santa Fe, some place where her particular type of beauty found better market than Dusty Creek. He had not thought about where she was in years. He had not thought about her in years, or not often, or not in ways that still had heat in them. He had thought about what she represented, which was the lesson of what happened when you chose the visible thing over the true thing. He waited. She walked to the fence and leaned on it and smiled at him and said, "Caleb, but you look exactly the same." "Lena," he said, "what do you need?" The smile did not flicker. She was good at that. "I'm staying at the hotel for a few weeks. Aunt Pierce has been unwell." He took that in. He nodded once. "I heard about your little seamstress," Lena said, and her tone was conversational, light, the tone of someone handling a small and slightly interesting object. "She seems sweet." "She's a grown woman," Caleb said. "Not a seamstress either. She runs a business." "Of course she does," the smile again. "Caleb, I just wanted to say hello. We're adults. It was a long time ago." "It was," he said. He set the gate latch and picked up the tool he had been using and turned back to work. "I'll leave you to it then," Lena said. She did not move immediately. She stood for a moment in the way of someone who is used to being detained, unaccustomed to the specific gravity that her presence exerted on men, waiting for the pull of it to work. He kept working. After a moment, he heard her walk back to her horse. He heard her ride away. He set the tool down and stood with his hands on the fence rail and looked out over the pasture and did what he sometimes did after contained things. He let the contained thing fully register, standing still in the particular aftermath of it. What he felt was not what he expected to feel, which was some version of the old pull, the old wound. What he felt was something considerably simpler and considerably less comfortable, the specific urgency of needing to go find May Calloway and make sure she was all right, and the recognition that this urgency was not the neutral concern of a decent man for a woman in his employ, but something else entirely, something that had been building since a barn in a storm and a foal delivered by lamplight. And he was done, he realized, pretending that it was anything other than what it was. He did not go to her that day. Going to her that day would have been the wrong move, reactive, impulsive, driven by the wrong things, and whatever was going to be said between them deserved to be said cleanly and without Lena's shadow attached to it. He went back to work. He worked the rest of Wednesday and all of Thursday, and on Friday morning he rode into town on legitimate business at the feed store, and he allowed himself, on the way back, to stop at Hattie's boarding house and ask through the open porch window whether May was in. Hattie looked at him from the window, with an expression that he could not read and did not have time to decipher before she said, She's in the back, working. He went around to the back. May was on the step with a lamp in a commission she was finishing, something white and detailed, her needle moving in the small, quick rhythm of someone doing something they could do without thought. She looked up when she heard his step. She looked at him with those eyes that registered things quickly and gave little away, and he thought, not for the first time, that she was beautiful in a way that required you to be paying attention, the kind of beauty that did not arrive with announcement, that built itself quietly out of the particular truth of a person's face. He stood on the path. He turned his hat in his hands, which was a habit he had not indulged in years because it was the habit of a nervous man, and he was not nervous. He was nervous. Lena came to the ranch, he said. May's needle paused, then resumed. I know, she said. Someone saw her riding out. I wanted you to know it didn't. He stopped. He started again with a different approach, whatever she said to you at the mercantile. She didn't say anything to me, May said evenly. She said something at me. There's a difference. He looked at her. She was threading a new length of white thread through the needle eye with the absolute precision of someone who had done it thousands of times, not looking at him, and the lamp was warm and low beside her, and the evening was coming in gold and soft over the backyard of Hattie's place, and he stood there with his hat in his hands like a man who has walked to the edge of a thing he planned to walk to the edge of, and is now standing at the edge of it and finding the drop more significant than he had calculated. May, he said. She looked up. He said, I want to be plain with you. You usually are, she said. There was not quite a smile in it, but there was something adjacent to a smile, something careful and warm, and it undid him completely, and he said, I think you're the finest woman I've ever seen. The words landed in the quiet evening like a stone in still water. She looked at him. Her hands had gone still on the sewing. Her face did what faces do when something arrives that they have been told for a very long time would never arrive for them. There was something complicated and rapid that moved behind her eyes, some private negotiation, and then something that settled after it. Caleb, she started. I don't mean that easy, he said. I don't mean how you look, though I could talk on that too. I mean all of it. The way you work. The way you don't ask to be observed working. The way you walked out of Hobbs's place with your spine straight when she tried to make you small and you didn't look for anyone to tell you she was wrong because you already knew she was wrong. Even if... He stopped. He looked at her. Even if you don't quite believe it yet, he said more quietly. She was not crying. She was the most controlled person he had ever met, and she did not cry. But there was something in her face that was rearranging itself, something fundamental and long-standing that was making room for a new structure, and he watched it happen and waited. I am ordinary, she said, and it was the last time she said it with conviction. He shook his head, slowly. Not the word, he said, not even close to the word. She set the sewing aside. She stood. She was not quite as tall as his shoulder, and she looked at him in the evening light with the same directness she applied to everything, and he looked back with all of it, the whole of his attention, the kind he had rationed for years, the kind that had gotten him into trouble before, and he was offering it anyway because she was the first thing that felt worth the risk of it. The space between them was the length of a question. He did not cross it. He held still and let the question exist because forcing an answer was not the kind of man he was with things that mattered. May was the one who moved. She took one step forward and she put her hand on his chest, just her palm, flat over the left side, where the thing he had sealed up years ago had been quietly unsealing itself for 2 months, and she looked up at him and said, I don't know what to do with this. Neither do I, he said. She laughed. It was a startled thing, a short, involuntary laugh, the kind that comes out of someone who has been expecting a different answer for so long that an honest one catches them unprepared, and it transformed her face completely, opened it, lit it, made it something he wanted to look at for a very long time. He raised his hand and put it over hers, over the place his heart was. He held it there. I am told, he said, that you figure it out as you go. Who told you that? Nobody, he said. Seemed reasonable. She laughed again, softer this time, and she did not take her hand away, and neither did he. And the evening came down warm and slow around the back of Hattie's boarding house. And somewhere in the house, Hattie moved around the kitchen in a way that suggested she was very carefully not coming outside, and the lamp beside May's abandoned sewing threw warm gold across the step. A season was ending and another was beginning, the way seasons do in flat country, gradually and then completely, the light changing so slow you almost miss the moment it becomes something new. And then you look up, and the sky is entirely different, and everything you thought you knew about the temperature of things has shifted, and there is no going back to the cold, and you find, standing in the new warmth, that you would not go back if you could, that the cold was never what you were made for, that you had simply been standing in it long enough to mistake it for your nature. The weeks that followed were not easy, and Caleb would not have trusted them if they had been. Easy was not the natural state of two people who had spent years learning how to need no one. You did not simply unlearn it because you wanted to, any more than land unlearned drought the first time it rained. There were mornings when May arrived at the ranch with her face closed and her hands busy and made no invitation for conversation, and he honored that because she had spent too many years being required to be open on demand, and he would not be one more demand. There were evenings when Caleb went entirely wordless in ways that Dylan, who now understood the landscape here, with the sheepish clarity of a man who had been operating without full information, handled with the unusual restraint of keeping his observations to himself. Lena was present at the edges of things, at the hotel, in town, unavoidable in the way that uncomfortable history is unavoidable. But she no longer exerted any gravitational pull on him that he had not already mapped and chosen against. Sheriff Ansel Pruitt stopped Caleb outside the feed store on a Thursday afternoon and said, with the directness of a man who had watched this town for 15 years, "She's a good woman, May Calloway," Caleb said. "I know that." "Don't let your history make her pay for what someone else did," Pruitt said. "That's not fair to her, and it's not honest about her." Caleb held the man's gaze for a moment. "I know that too," he said. Pruitt nodded once and went on his way, which was all either of them required of the exchange. May, for her part, she was navigating something private and difficult, the specific labor of disassembling a belief system that has served you for a long time, even if the belief was wrong, and the service it rendered was only the service of making the world predictable. Ordinary was predictable. Ordinary was a kind of shelter. If you were ordinary, you could not be disappointed by not being chosen. Because ordinary was never going to be chosen, you had already absorbed that outcome, had built a life within it that was real and sufficient and yours. Caleb Rourke was threatening the sufficiency of it, and there were days when she resented this, when she wished he had stayed across the street and kept his enormous, careful, observant attention directed at fence lines and cattle. When she sat with Hattie at the kitchen table and said nothing, and Hattie said nothing back, and it was enough, just enough, to not be alone in it. But the resentment passed. It always passed because underneath it was something she had not expected to feel again at 29, which was hope, uncomplicated and stubborn as the first green thing after a dry season, growing without asking permission in the cracked earth of her, reaching for the light without any guarantee that the light would stay. The morning Caleb came for her properly was a Sunday in late September, when the panhandle had finally released its summer grip and the air had the particular clarity of a sky that has been washed clean. She was on Hattie's front porch with her coffee when he rode up, and he dismounted and tied his horse and came up the steps with his hat in his hand and stood in the early light and said, "Come out to the ranch today. I want to show you something." It was not a speech. It was not a declaration. It was an invitation, plain and direct, the way all of his words were. And she looked at him standing in the morning with his weathered face and his quiet eyes, and the hat turning in his hands that he probably wasn't aware of, and she said, "All right." The something he wanted to show her was the foal. The foal, her foal, she supposed, in some oblique and unofficial sense, had grown into a young horse with good legs and a calm disposition, and the specific confidence of an animal that had been handled well from its first hours. Caleb opened the paddock gate, and they stood in the early sun, and the foal came to May without hesitation and pushed his nose into her outstretched hand, and she ran her palm along the bridge of his nose and felt something so full it almost hurt. "He's yours," Caleb said beside her. She looked up. "I can't afford—" I'm not selling him, Caleb said. I'm giving him to you. She was quiet. Then, Caleb, that's a valuable animal. Yes, he said. He was looking at the foal, or appearing to. So are you. The stillness of the morning held them in it. The foal moved away, uninterested in human complexity, with the philosophical indifference of horses. May looked at the wide, flat sky over the panhandle, which went on past the point of comprehension, which was always going on regardless of what happened below it. Why, and she felt the last piece of the old armor give, not break, not shatter, but simply release, the way a thing that has been held under pressure releases when the pressure is no longer necessary. And she turned to Caleb Rourke and said, I don't know how to be someone who accepts things. I know, he said. I'll help you. It was the most generous sentence she had ever heard because it asked nothing and offered everything, not rescue but company, not a solution, but a steadying hand from someone who understood because he had been standing in the same place, needing the same thing for years longer than she had. She stepped toward him. He was already turned toward her as he always was, with the complete and unstageable attention of a man who has finally allowed himself to look at the thing he could not stop looking at anyway. She put both hands on his chest and looked up at him and said, I'm still learning to believe it. Take your time, he said, and his hands came up and settled at her waist, careful, certain, the way he set a fence post, like something he was putting down to stay. And the morning light fell full and warm across the paddock and the full-cropped grass at the fence line, and somewhere across the yard the hands were beginning the day's work, and the ranch was alive with its ordinary sounds, and none of it was ordinary at all. That evening there was lamplight through the kitchen window of the ranch house, and two shadows moving in the same kitchen, one large and deliberate, one quick and steady, and through the glass you could hear something that might have been conversation and might have been laughter, and was both, interwoven. The sound of two people in the same room who have chosen it, who are choosing it, who will go on choosing it in the plain and sustaining way of people who have learned to trust the quiet weight of something real.